there's a concept that I've been talking about in my own head and with some people recently, which I call leap of faith logic. And let me explain what that is a little bit. So, leap of faith logic is the way I would define it is it's when you're forming an opinion or you're making an argument or that type of thing, and you hit a point in which you have to take a leap of faith rather than use just pure kind of science and logic and data, what have you, to formalize your opinion or your viewpoint or make your argument work, right? Or in some cases, even like prove out a hypothesis. And the reason I call it leap of faith logic is it's not your typical leap of logic, which happens all the time, which I would say is almost always a bad thing, right? Those leaps of logic come from biases and poor thinking and lazy thinking and things like that, right? For example, I've never seen racism, so I don't believe it exists in America, right? That's a leap of logic there, right? Just because a sample of one hasn't seen it, and assuming that you've been on the lookout for it and you know how to spot it, all those things. Like there's so many assumptions built into that make that argument or that viewpoint not a good one, right? So those leaps in logic almost always are a bad thing. And those are the things I often talk about and we're trying to identify in our thinking and avoid, right? Leap of faith logic, as I say, though, is different because in leap of faith logic, you are very aware of it, right? So probably the most prime example of leap of faith logic is when it comes to religion, right? Most people that believe in God or believe in some religion are reasonable and aware enough to say there's no actual scientific proof of it, but they believe in the thing so deeply, so strongly. In many cases, you'll hear people say that they've experienced it in some way, whether it be like they've seen some sign from God or there's just something in their experience which makes it real to them. And that makes them know that God is real, religion is real, what have you. And again, I think for reasonable, rational people, they would admit that, hey, I am taking a leap of faith here in logic, but I'm doing it knowingly, and I'm doing it because there's no other way, right? It's not something that I can prove to you. I can't show my work to you on this and make it clear and prove to everyone that it's real. But again, it's so important, it means so much, and it feels so real to me that I'm gonna act as if I can. So that's kind of leap of faith logic, right? And again, religion being the perfect example of it. There's a challenge with leap of faith logic though, right? And religion is the perfect example where you see it. For those people that are either inherently skeptical, have some motivation to not believe in religion, or are just super analytical, scientific, data-driven, what have you, it's a difficult thing for them to believe, right? They are not willing to take that leap of faith. And when you get into a discussion with somebody, that person who's not willing to take the leap of faith will obviously call out that you can't prove this, right? There's no science behind this. You're taking a leap of faith in your logic. And the other person says, yeah, that's right. And then the more scientific person, if you will, says like, well, okay, then we're done here. Like, what are we doing? This isn't a real conversation then, right? If you can't prove this out, what's the point of even discussing this? And they're both maybe right. It's possible these instances exist in the world where either because science hasn't caught up yet, or maybe science will never catch up. It's just it's outside of the realm of science in some way. There are things that happen that some people are very comfortable taking this leap of faith logic on. And I bring this up, one, because I think it's an interesting concept, because, there's people think in different ways. And part of the reason why science has progressed as far as it has, and, it is what it is because of the scientific method. And because if somebody identifies or observes something and wants to prove it out, there's a rigid structure they have to follow. They have to test it, they have to be able to prove it, and somebody else has to be able to replicate it and test it and prove it. It's all very analytical in it. And then we can all kind of get on board and say, okay, I understand gravity is real, or okay, I understand the earth is round, right? And there's always going to be people that, no matter how much science you show them, they're not going to believe it. But for most reasonable people, they can get behind it and say, okay, we're all on the same page here. We understand what we're dealing with because there was the process that figured it out. In leap of faith logic, again, you don't have that. But the cause or the thing is usually so important that it almost demands some version of that, right? The religious wars we've seen throughout history in some ways speak to this. So another instance of this, though, where I think this leap of faith logic might come up is when it comes to racism in America, particularly, maybe around the world, but I live in America. And I say that, let me explain why I say that. I guess let me not even preface it. Let me just explain why I say that. If you subscribe to the idea that, white privilege is real, which a lot of people do, and I think there's some merit and rational thinking in that, part of the premise of that is, if you are white, you can never really understand racism. You can't understand what it's like to be a black man walking down the street, or being followed around in a store, or being scared every time you get pulled over, or just whatever it is, not getting a job, whatever it is, right? The idea is you can't, as a white person, understand that. You never could. No matter how hard you tried, no matter what you read, no matter how much you talk to your black friends, whatever it is, you're never going to fully understand it. But for black people, it is very real, right? For many of them, it's very tangible. It's very clear. You can almost parallel that to, I'm not saying it's the same in terms of, it's in the sky somewhere, but the religion example, right? For some people, religion is very real. They can't see him or her or whatever. They can't prove it, but they know God is there, right? For many black people, it's a similar thing. Like, I can't show it to you. I can't make you see it the way I see it, white person, but I know it's there. I felt it. I see it. So it's a very similar concept. Now, you might come in and say, well, yeah, but there's data and there's some proof around racism. And that's true, right? There is certainly some data around it. But unfortunately, a lot of the data, you can look at it through the lens you want to look at it, right? I'll give you a good example of this, and it's just a sample of one, and I'm sure there's other instances that might be better or worse. But, you talk about police brutality and, black people being killed by white cops, ultimately. And you'll see all sorts of numbers, many of you have probably already seen it, that people will show if they want to make the case that police brutality and racism in the police force isn't real. And they'll say, hey, more white people were killed by cops than black people, right? Or, whatever it might be. So there's always going to be data that can be shown different ways. And in a lot of cases, racism is so deep-rooted and systematic in how we function. It's hard to see. It's hard to quantify. Right? It steps back so many levels, right? You can look at a company and say, hey, how many black people work there? And there's a low amount of black people, right? A tech company, let's say. And you say, oh, well, there's your racism, look at that. But then somebody could back it up and say, well, how many people actually applied? And they'd say, well, not that many applied, so actually no racism. But then you go back a step further and you say, well, how many were in a position to actually apply? How many get into college and can take the courses? And now it starts getting convoluted, right? But again, for the black person, it's not, right? It's real. It's there. They know it. They just can't show it to somebody. They can't show it to a white person. So you have this situation where leap of faith logic comes in. And what's being asked from a white person perspective is to take that leap of faith logic. You're being asked to say, hey, I know you'll never see it and you'll never be able to feel it, but trust me, it's there, and act accordingly. And much like with religion, you have some people that just really, really struggle with that, particularly when it's for something that is not naturally, a top of mind cause or thing for them, right? You'll be surprised how often you see, logical leaps from people that seem very rational and analytical and data driven, but when it comes to a certain topic they care about, they'll throw that out the window and just kind of take anecdotal. You'd be surprised how often that happens. But when it's a cause that's not natural to them, not top of mind for them, it's very hard for them to make that leap of faith. So, it's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing of how you account for that. And it almost feels like there's something that needs to be created, much like the scientific method, but some way to define that, some way to prove that out that doesn't rely just on the traditional scientific method, because it doesn't account for things like this. Now, again, I could hear somebody saying, well, if it doesn't account for it and it doesn't fit into the scientific method, then it's just not real. Maybe. But racism feels like such a big issue that we can't just go on that. You can't just assume because we can't see it and feel it, then it must not be real. It's too important. It's too detrimental to us as a people in the country to just dismiss it for that reason. We have to at least try and find another way to make it real, so that it can be clear to everybody that action needs to be taken. Because unfortunately, it's been too long of a time to where if we just hope everybody's going to take this leap of faith logic and get on board and change it and fix it, it's just not happening. So we need to prove it out in some way and actually show it, to really get the change that we want to see. Seems like the path that we have to take.